So first we have Bruce Vogt, who is the Ecosystem Science Manager at NOAA. Bruce is from a small fishing community in Virginia where he developed a passion for science, marshes, and the animals that live in estuaries. He holds a master's degree from the Virginia Institute of Marine Science and currently works to support and translate science that informs management of living resources. He enjoys spending time outdoors with his wife and two boys, listening to music and cooking. Next, we have Ray Lee, who's a biologist with over 20 years of experience in habitat conservation and restoration with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in the Great Lakes and now in the Chesapeake Bay. He has a bachelor's in science in wildlife and fisheries biology from University of Massachusetts and a master's of science in wildlife and fisheries science from Texas A&M University. He's currently a transportation liaison with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in Maryland and primarily involved with streamline environmental review of transportation projects. Next, we have Allison Santoro, who leads the Restoration Science section with the Maryland Department of Natural Resources Watershed and Climate Service Unit. She provides technical expertise on habitat restoration in streams, forests, and wetland management grants for the Chesapeake and Atlantic Coastal Bays Trust Fund and other state funds. In her spare time, she flies drones to capture aerial imagery of habitat restoration projects to better understand how these sites change over time. As a co-chair of the Chesapeake Bay Program Stream Health Work Group, she takes a holistic view of the entire Chesapeake Bay watershed to incorporate science in watershed management. Next, we have Pam Mason, who is recently retired as a senior research scientist at the Center for Coastal Resource Management at the Virginia Institute of Marine Science, William & Mary. She has a bachelor's of arts in biology from the University of Delaware and a master's in science in marine science from William & Mary, Virginia Institute of Marine Science. She's been working on coastal resource issues for several decades with a focus on integrated management of shorelines, wetlands, and coastal community resilience. Her current research interest is multiple benefits of natural and nature-based features, including living shorelines, tidal and non-tidal wetlands, environmental policy, and coastal management. Next, we have Brooke Landry. Brooke Landry is an SAV ecologist at Maryland's Department of Natural Resources and chair of the Chesapeake Bay Program's SAV work group. Her work spans the gamut from SAV research, focused primarily on anthropogenic drivers of SAV dynamics, to restoration, monitoring, outreach, and management. She runs the Chesapeake Bay SAV Watchers Program, a volunteer monitoring effort, as well as the brand new Chesapeake Bay SAV Sentinel Site Monitoring Program. On the management front, she leads the development and implementation of the Bay Program's SAV management strategy and biennial work plans by translating her own research and that of partners and collaborators into actionable approaches to SAV conservation and recovery. We do have one last speaker who was just a little bit late on getting the bio and headshot to me. So if you want to come ahead off of mute and turn your camera on and just introduce yourself super quickly, that would be great, Daniel. Oh, looks like he's actually not on yet. So when he does come on and give his presentation, it looks like we'll get that introduction for him. But with that, we can go ahead and get into our first outcome presentation. Next slide. And that'll be with Bruce.
Thanks, Bianca. Hi, all. Bruce Vogt with the NOAA Chesapeake Bay office and also the Sustainable Fisheries Goal Implementation team. I appreciate the introduction. First, we just wanted to start by saying, while I'm representing these outcomes today, a whole lot of work and thought went into this from a whole host of partners that are associated with the Sustainable Fisheries Goal Implementation team. I also want to recognize Christina Garvey, who's sitting with me today, who's a staffer for the Fisheries Get and really helped shepherd this whole process to get us to the draft outcomes and targets you're going to hear about in a little more detail in a moment. You can see from this slide, and I don't even think this is everyone, but we have state jurisdictions, fishery managers represented. We have academic partners, we have non-governmental organizations and federal agencies all represented and putting thought into what these outcomes should look like to really guide us into the future of Bay Program restoration and protection with an emphasis on ensuring that we have sustainable fisheries and healthy habitats into the future that both support local communities, fishermen and seafood production, as well as provide recreational opportunities. So that's by way of introduction, and I'm going to transition here to talk a little bit about the blue crab outcome first. You can advance the slide. So yeah, the first up is the blue crab, what we were calling the blue crab sustainability outcome. This is really focused on ensuring we have sustainable blue crab populations and a healthy fishery. Next slide. The 2014 agreement is shown here. I think this is the first time, well, it wasn't the first time, but obviously blue crabs are iconic to the Chesapeake Bay. It's a thriving fishery. It provides a lot of economic benefit to the region, particularly to the watermen that are fishing for the blue crabs. But blue crabs are also a really important part of the ecosystem. They're prey for other things. They serve a role themselves in their biology and supporting a healthy bay. So we recognized back in 2014 that we really want to put more emphasis on ensuring blue crab populations were sustainable. And this really came on the heels of an agreement by the two governors in Maryland and Virginia, I think around 2008, 2009, that we need to put more emphasis on protecting the female portion of the the blue crab population. And so we ended up with the current outcome, which was to maintain 215 million adult female crabs. We've since refined that population target, as we said we could do in the outcome you see here, to 196 based off of new information. But the outcome I'm going to talk about next, where we're going in the future, really builds off of this. Go ahead. So we recognize that while we've been successful in maintaining populations within the reference points, really since 2014, with the exception of 1 year, that's, the work doesn't end. It's an ongoing thing. We assess the population each year. The assessment of that population is used by managers to determine what sort of, harvest restrictions or not they may put on the fishery. But there's a whole process that goes into this. We did have an outcome under the current agreement to look at some different management approaches to blue crabs, and decided that the current framework focusing on female conservation was still our best option and the most scientifically robust option. And so the blue crab management outcome was completed. We also recognize, so we didn't really address looking at any sort of new management framework in the outcomes we're presenting today. We did, however, recognize that the cross-jurisdictional component of the outcome was really critical. We need to ensure that the three jurisdictions, Virginia, Potomac River, and Maryland, are basically working from the same sheet of music in managing blue crabs. So they're getting the same science, and they're making decisions around the same science, and they're making decisions in a way that are, I guess, mutually beneficial to the blue crab population. So we've maintained that element. And then because we're sort of we are currently conducting a new benchmark stock assessment for blue crabs. The last one was in 2011. And so we're going to have some new information very soon at the end of this year, really the beginning of 2026. That's going to inform what management targets, or what we refer to as sort of reference points, we want to set for the population. So because of that, you'll see that we don't provide specific numbers that we're trying to maintain, trying to achieve, because we're waiting on that new information to become available. So those are some of the key pieces that went into our thinking around the new outcome language. You can move on to that slide. So the structure of the new agreement has outcomes and then targets. So what you see here in the bold letters is the outcome, and then the two bullet points are the targets. associated with achieving that outcome. So as you see, this outcome didn't change too much, except it doesn't have specific numbers in it. But we're still working to achieve a sustainable bay-wide blue crab fishery through cross-jurisdictional coordination that supports healthy blue crab populations and thriving fishing communities. The targets are really how are we going to get there? How are we going to achieve that healthy blue crab fishery? So the first one, to continually maintain abundance and harvest rates targets as determined by the 2026 benchmark stock assessment. That stock assessment will generate new information that may help us refine the current reference points for female crabs in particular, but it also will provide information on male and juvenile crabs and on sort of the, I guess, performance of the fishery as a whole. So we're looking forward to that coming out to address that target and have more refined benchmark reference points we're going to work towards. And then the second bullet is really about the process by which the blue crab management occurs each year. So each year we get together a group under the Sustainable Fisheries Goal Implementation Team called the Chesapeake Bay Stock Assessment Committee. That group reviews the winter dredge survey results for blue crabs. So that's a survey that collects crabs during the winter at about 1,500 sites, compiles all that information, and develops a population estimate for adult female, adult male, and juvenile crabs. There's other information in there, but essentially that's what gives us an annual assessment of the population each year. And then the Chesapeake Bay Stock Assessment Committee, based on what they see in that, will provide recommendations to the management jurisdictions on what they should be thinking about when they're making their management decisions at the beginning of the harvest season. So we plan to continue that process to help us achieve and maintain that sustainable bay-wide blue crab fishery. And that's it for blue crab.
Thanks so much, Bruce. I know you're giving the next presentation as well on oysters. It looks like we don't have any questions in the chat so far, but again, for participants, if you have any questions, feel free to ask those and we will get to them after the presentation. So Bruce, if you want to keep going with oysters, we'll have that up next.
Sure, we can keep rolling. So the oyster outcome, you can go to the next slide, actually, Bianca. Thank you. Under the current 2014 agreement, the focus is really on restoring oyster reefs and the result in oyster populations. So we decided at the time that we needed to take a larger scale approach to restoration to have bigger benefits. At the time, there was a lot of smaller scale restoration projects happening, sort of through individual partners and partnerships. We decided that another approach that we thought would be more successful was to get partners working more closely together, but doing things on a larger scale in specific tributaries. So that's what led to the current outcome to restore 10 tributaries by 2025. That's the shorthand we use for it. And the good news is we're about to achieve that goal this year. We will be done. And this is the largest scale oyster restoration anywhere on the planet that we can find. And that's probably true if you just look at one of these tributaries, and we're doing it 10 times over. So for instance, Harris Creek had about 350 acres of oysters restored. That was our first one. That was sort of the poster child for how this could work. As part of this process, we also developed really robust performance metrics to assess how the restoration was performing over time. And so we've applied both a really clear planning process to restoring these tributaries and an evaluation process. And there's multiple partners that have been involved, from my organization, NOAA, to the Army Corps, to both Maryland and Virginia. Oyster Recovery Partnership and VIMS and others have really been a big part of this. Next. So a couple of things that we were thinking about, though, that we thought could be different is to incorporate the fishery a little bit more into the next outcome. So the previous one, as I mentioned, was very much about restoring reefs and oyster populations, but didn't really account for the fishery and the work that both jurisdictions were doing to implement more sustainable, practices for managing the fishery to, make it more sustainable and produce more oysters. And so you'll see in a minute, we have an outcome that is more geared towards that, the sustainable fishery aspect of oyster populations. We also recognize that even though we're going to meet the 10 tributary goal, we're not done. There's still a need for more oyster reef construction and restoration throughout the bay, and there are opportunities to continue that work and maintain the partnerships that we put in place to achieve the large scale efforts so far. And then lastly, even though we're going to meet our target, our current outcome, there's still a need to sort of assess whether or not those reefs are, persisting and continuing to be successful over time. And so we thought it was important to have something in this next agreement around maintaining the reefs that we've already restored and monitoring those. So that's the thinking that went into the language. And next slide. So this is where we landed. Rather straightforward. We want to increase the ecosystem benefits from oysters through reef habitat restoration, sustainable harvest, and aquaculture. So those last two elements, sustainable harvest and aquaculture, were not in the previous outcome, but now are, including the continued efforts to restore oyster reef habitat. So the targets that we'll use to sort of meet that outcome are to continue restoration efforts. We do put a specific number in here. We're aiming for 1,800 additional acres above and beyond what we've currently done. And we would like to try to keep that a little more geographically focused. You see that we don't mention tributaries this time the way we did before. We think there's opportunity to do restoration outside of that kind of tributary context, but we still want to try to keep it large scale. Doesn't mean everything will be a large scale, but we want to try to keep it mostly, large scale restoration efforts, because that's where we think we get the most benefit from the reefs, and it allows the oyster populations to grow and persist over time. The second target is the fishery one, so that is maintaining a sustainable oyster abundance. And so we'll need to put some work into defining what exactly that is. Luckily, Maryland and Virginia both have, some recent information that I think will help guide the details of this particular target. But this will be an opportunity to bring in both the aquaculture and the harvesters into the conversation and recognize the efforts that they and the managers have done to help create a healthier oyster fishery in the bay. And then lastly is the maintenance. So that's essentially monitoring the reefs that we've already restored and ensuring that they continue to meet the success metrics that we've laid out. So that's where we are with oysters.
All right, thank you so much, Bruce. It looks like you did a wonderful job of explaining, because we still don't have any questions in the chat for you. I know we're coming back to you in a little bit, but we can move on to fish passage with Ray.
Yeah, so hi, my name is Ray Lee, and I'm a fisheries biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I'm located out of the Chesapeake Bay Field Office in Annapolis, Maryland. One of two co-chairs for the Fish Passage Work Group, which is an outcome under the Habitat Goal Implementation Team. So today, I'll be sharing proposed updates to the Fish Passage outcome for the 2025 Bay Agreement. Next slide, please. So our current outcome is to restore migratory fish access to 132 miles of freshwater rivers and streams every 2 years. And more specifically, we're targeting restoration efforts on alewife, blueback herring, American shad, hickory shad, American eel, and brook trout. And so for the work group, that essentially means that we're removing obsolete dams that no longer serve its original purpose, or that we're installing structural fishways over dams to provide passage for migratory fish. And these migratory fish typically occur along the lower tributaries of the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And for brook trout, they're generally restricted to headwater streams way up in the watershed. I should note here that this outcome was actually updated in 2020 after we had achieved our original 2014 Bay Agreement outcome to restore fish passage to 1,000 miles of habitat. Looking forward, our proposed outcome for the 2025 Bay Agreement is to remove barriers and restore aquatic organism passage to 150 miles of habitat every 2 years, and that's throughout the Bay watershed. Next slide, please. So we're looking to keep the main intent the same, and we're not proposing any significant changes to the fish passage outcome here, but we are proposing updates to our scope and mileage targets. Specifically, we're proposing to, one, broaden the scope of our work, so shifting from a migratory fish focus to include all native fish and other aquatic organisms. And two, to increase our quantitative targets from 132 miles of habitat every 2 years to 150 miles of habitat every 2 years. Next slide, please. So there's a couple of different reasons why we're proposing a shift focus from migratory fish to include all fish and other aquatic organisms. First, in the past, the work group has heavily emphasized fish passage projects that benefit indigenous fish like American shad and river herring. And so most of this work targeted barriers located along the lower tributaries of the Chesapeake Bay. But we also recognize that resident fish and other aquatic organisms, including important recreational fisheries and host fishes for freshwater mussels, need to move along rivers and streams to find food, to avoid predators, and to seek refuge from extreme temperatures and flow fluctuations. And so we wanted to better balance the portfolio of projects. Second, with this update, we will broaden the geographic scope of projects and therefore make the outcome more relevant to all the different jurisdictions across the Bay watershed. And so hopefully encourage more active work group participation and engagement from headwater states. Third, removing dams will restore river habitat conditions and result in many co-benefits beyond just fish passage. Things like reestablishing natural stream flow and improving sediment transport and water quality. This will support other living resource and water quality related goals of the Chesapeake Bay Agreement and encourage collaboration with other goal implementation teams and outcomes. Our increase in stream mileage goal was based on a couple of different considerations. One of the things that we looked at was our outcomes since the start of the 2014 agreement. And we found that we've generally achieved that 132 mile of fish passage every 2-year goal. The one and only exception was back in 2020, 2021, which was a period that coincided with the COVID outbreak, and that paused progress for most projects. Second, shift in focus to include all aquatic organisms should help to refocus efforts and therefore increase number of fish passage restoration projects. In addition, we're seeing increased work by the state and federal DOTs or the transportation departments to replace and improve road stream crossings. And the majority of these DOT projects are actually being designed and built with aquatic organism passage in mind. The last consideration is funding. There's lots of uncertainty with funding at both the state and federal levels right now. And so there might be less resources available to support aquatic organism passage projects. but we're hopeful that by broadening scope of projects, we'll create opportunities to build new partnerships to implement the restoration projects. Next slide. That's all that I have for today. Open it up to any questions, if any.
Thanks so much, Ray. We do have a question in the chat for you. Lisa's asking, how will you address potential increased movement of invasive species resulting from increased connectivity?
Yeah, that's something that comes up quite frequently within the work group for a lot of projects and invasive and balancing invasive species with native species restoration is obviously one of the challenges of fish passage restoration. We haven't addressed it yet as a work group. A lot of the different states, as well as federal agencies, have policies and guidance that balance the benefits and cons or risk of such fish passage projects. But that is something that's certainly on the radar of our work group and something that we are talking about, but we haven't developed any guidance documents or anything like that yet from the fish passage work group's perspective.
Thank you. We've got another question in the chat. This one says, Breton Bay in St. Mary's County was initially considered to be one of the tributaries that would be in the oyster restoration program. It was bumped off the list because oyster restoration was unlikely to succeed. Over the years since that decision was made, local organizations have been doing the restoration work and have planted over 2 million oysters in Breton Bay. Will the state be coming back to evaluate the work that has been done in Breton Bay? Looks like that's a question actually for oysters. So, Bruce, if you want to come back and answer that one really quick, that would be great.
I can't speak to what the state plans to do to monitor that area. One thing that does come to mind, though, that I think we were trying to recognize through the new outcome language is that because we're not focused on specific tributaries and we've left the door open a little bit more, I think it adds some more flexibility for working more closely with community groups like you just mentioned in St. Mary's and Breton Bay that I don't think we worked as closely with under the current outcome as we could. So we did think about that, and while I said we want to continue things at a large scale, I think we're also have left the door open for more of that collective work with smaller areas and community organizations, as well as the bigger partnership work that's occurring. But I can't speak to the monitoring of that site. We'll have to follow up with Maryland DNR reps. But thanks for the question.
Thanks, Bruce. We do have another question in the chat. Have you considered utilizing the NAACC stream continuity protocol assessments for aquatic passage for both tidal and non-tidal areas for roads and bridges within the Chesapeake Bay watershed?
Yeah, we do. We actually use that tool quite a bit here in Maryland, and I know a lot of the other states within the Bay watershed does road stream crossing assessments using that protocol. And we've actually incorporated that map layer, that NAACC map layer, into our fish passage prioritization tool that the work group has developed in partnership with TNC to identify where the blockages are, where the fish passage blockages are, and then to prioritize restoration efforts.
Great, thank you so much. We're gonna go ahead and move on. Looks like there's no more questions for that specific presentation right now. So next we have Bruce again with Fish Habitat.
All right, thank you. Yeah, so the fish habitat outcome. This is a new one under the 2014 agreement. I think the idea was to, ensure that we were putting more emphasis on living resources and habitat, in addition to the focus that was already being placed on water quality. And so you can go to the next slide so we can look at the 2014 language. So the 2014 language was really about trying to improve the science and information and conduct fish habitat assessments in some of these critical areas like spawning, nursery, and forage areas to try to help support restoration and conservation efforts. And so it was rather big. It didn't have a geographic focus. It was essentially the entire watershed and tidal and non-tidal portions of the bay. And so it was a little hard to really focus on exactly what we were trying to achieve. That said, we were able to get a lot done. We supported a lot of science that resulted in some habitat suitability assessments for specific species that sort of demonstrated different modeling and assessment approaches that we are going to leverage moving forward. And we were also able to work through NIFWIF and other partners to submit proposals for habitat restoration, fish habitat restoration that have been successful. We were able to work with the Atlantic Coast Fish Habitat Partnership to get some projects funded where we are connecting recreational fishing organizations with restoration projects. So those are just some examples. I won't go through everything, but I wanted to highlight one. This wasn't quantitative, so it's hard to really measure success and focus. However, that we didn't let that stop us, and we did get a lot done through this. So because of that, we all recognize, at least on the fishery side, that we really need healthy habitat to support fish production. And so we thought it was important to have a fish habitat outcome in the revised agreement. So next slide. Some of the things that we're considering, in addition to what I just said about the current outcome, is that there were some conversations happening. I don't know how many people online are familiar with what we refer to as the CSER report, the Comprehensive Evaluation System Response that the Science Technical Advisory Committee put together. But that report highlighted that we may be able to achieve bigger impacts for living resources if we focus more in shallow water, both to improve water quality conditions, but also structured and other habitat conditions for fish. And so that prompted some conversations with the Bay program, in particular Lee, the current director, and some of the stack authors and those of us at NOAA and elsewhere to think about how we could start to implement some of the recommendations in that CSER report. And so where we've landed is we are currently developing a living resource assessment. What that'll do, or the outcome of that, will be creating a fish habitat suitability score for each of the 92 segments that are used for the TMDL. So we'll have a score for each segment, and then the plan is to use that to help us better target restoration efforts, both water quality and habitat restoration efforts. So we factor that work that was already starting into the outcome language you'll see in a minute. We didn't show you the forage outcome language for the 2014 agreement, but we did have a forage outcome. We've decided that we won't have a forage outcome moving forward, but we have incorporated the work around forage into the targets you'll see in a minute. So, forage, essentially food, right? For some of the other fish species like, striped bass and other higher, I'll just say important commercial and ecologically important species. We need to understand what that prey base or how much food is available to help us understand if there's enough to really support the populations of those fish over time. And so it's really important. We just didn't think it needed to be an outcome, and so we've included it as a target. And then lastly, but maybe this is a bigger picture one that we should have started with, is while the current outcome, both was watershed wide, both tidal and non-tidal, we decided to keep that tidal and non-tidal focus going forward. So we have some distinct targets that are tidal and some distinct targets that are non-tidal, but what we were hearing as we presented to the management board and elsewhere is that some opportunity for the title and non-title folks to talk and communicate about what they're doing was really important. And so we've combined both of those non-title and title targets under one fish habitat outcome. Next slide. So this is where we've landed with the outcome. Achieve and maintain suitable shallow water fish habitat in tidal and non-tidal areas for key species through focused water quality conservation and restoration improvements, informed by a synthesis of fisheries science and habitat assessments. So I don't know if we did the best job at cutting out the number of words we have in the outcome, but essentially what's that's saying is it's a little more specific and clear than the other one in that we are trying to achieve some metric of suitable shallow water fish habitat, and that the metric of that, or the baseline and the metrics by which we evaluate suitable shallow water fish habitat will be achieved through some scientific efforts. It might look a little bit different for tidal than non-tidal, but the concept is the same. We're trying to assess the current conditions and then try to find ways to either achieve improved conditions or maintain existing conditions where they're still good. So the targets that you see here, the first two are tidal and the last three are non-tidal for the bullets. So the first tidal one is really to conduct that tidal water fish habitat assessment, to develop a baseline of current conditions and then track improvements over time as we begin to target areas for water quality and habitat restoration to see if we can turn the dial, in a positive way to improve those fish habitat conditions. So the assessment completed in 2026 is the effort I referred to on the previous slide, to do a living resource assessment and score each of the 92 segments for their fish habitat suitability. The second bullet is related to the forage that I've already talked about a little bit. We wanted to try to take the work that we've done around forage. So we've identified which species of forage are the most important for some of the key predators in the bay. We developed essentially stats and trends for a lot of those species. What we haven't done is sort of compiled that information in a way that can really be used to guide decision making in fishery management and I guess more broadly for Chesapeake Bay, protection and restoration management. So we want to try to build on the work that we did and put that into I guess more digestible, more useful indicators of forage status. And so could look like something like a series of indicators that are kind of stoplight chart, red, yellow, green kind of thing, where we think the populations are either in a good place, maybe they're we're not sure, or they're poor. And by putting it in that context, then it prompts more of the idea is that prompts more of a discussion around, well, why are we, maybe unclear about their status, or is that really a reason for caution and concern? Or if they're poor, what does that mean for management of some of the predators, since most of the forage are not managed? So when it maybe got a little weedy there, but just trying to give a flavor of what we're trying to achieve through that target. And then, as I said, the last three targets are really non-tidal. So that third bullet is similar to the tidal one, to establish a baseline and assess the overall condition of fish habitat suitability, and then use that to guide restoration and management decisions. The next one is acid mine drainage. So this is something that the Habitat Goal team identified as a major stressor to fish health, and so the plan is to work closely with Brook Trout outcome to try to better understand the impacts of acid mine drainage, and then use that information to guide restoration and mitigation efforts. And then lastly is freshwater mussels. there's been a lot of more emphasis, I guess, put on freshwater mussels in the past couple of years. There's been a couple of workshops held. They are a really important species up in those non-tidal areas for the habitat that they provide, the filtration that they provide. There's connectivity to other fish species like eel. So important species. We need to spend a little more time trying to figure out what, restoration of those freshwater or conservation and restoration of those freshwater mussels would look like. But this target is calling for a plan for 5 tributaries to do that as a starting point. So that's it for fish habitat.
Thanks so much, Bruce. We do have just a couple questions in the chat for you really quick. The first is, has the depth of shallow water been defined yet?
Not in a quantitative way, Jim. I think you've been part of the conversations. We haven't defined it for the living resource assessment either. The couple, I'll just say, I think 5 meters has been one of the options that would allow at 5 meters, that would incorporate most of the oyster reef habitat. Certainly the areas that we're restoring, because we don't really restore oysters beyond that depth because of dissolved oxygen concerns. And I think would get us, so essentially shoreline out to 5 meters would incorporate a pretty good amount of sort of that critical fish habitat. But as you know, love to have your thoughts and input on that, but we haven't made a determination as of yet.
The next question from Renee is, will indicators be developed for both outcomes and targets?
I guess that's kind of for everyone, right?
Yes, anybody who wants to answer that can go ahead and answer.
We will have indicators that allow us to assess performance for oyster restoration, for sure. We probably would need an indicator for, I think it's going to look a little bit different across the outcomes. Certainly for blue crab, the stock assessment will generate reference points, and those will be the indicator, those will be the guideposts we use to assess whether or not the population is sustainable or not. And so that ties to the outcome, right? For fish habitat, I think it's going to be a little bit different. We'll certainly develop the scorecard that I mentioned and sort of the living resource assessment. That'll help us identify where are we currently achieving fish habitat suitability and where are we not. That's what the outcome says. And so that the target to generate that living resource assessment will inform whether or not we're achieving the outcome. And then for oysters, I think is going to be a little bit mixed because we will have the existing success metrics to assess restoration, the continuity of the restoration efforts. We may develop a different set of metrics to sort of measure progress and performance of the new reefs that are constructed. And then the fishery one, I saw Verna, you had a question earlier. I think the fishery one is still to be determined exactly how we will define sustainable oyster populations through the fishery. I think there's a lot more discussion to be had there and what that definition would be and what the metrics would be to assess that. So sorry, I went on a bit for a while there.
Thank you, Bruce. And not a question, but just a comment from Peter Tango. Agree. He believes indicator matching to outcome and or targets is still a matter of discussion to be determined if it's going to be one-to-one or some other relationship. So thank you, Peter. And thank you, Bruce. We can go ahead and move on to Brook Trout with Dan. Dan, if you want to just come off mute real quick and introduce yourself, and we'll stop sharing so that you can share your presentation.
Yeah, hi. Sorry about all that. I was not getting the emails as the presenter, so I just threw together a talk quick in the last 15 minutes, but I'm Dan Getz. I'm the Regional Operations Manager for Maryland DNR Freshwater Fisheries. And I also serve as a co-chair for the Brook Trout Work Group with Katie Ambalski. So going to walk you through how we got to our new outcome language here in a second, once I can share my screen. All right, can everybody see that?
Yes. You're not.
Okay.
Yeah, there you go. We're in presentation mode.
All right,
Great.
there we're in presentment. Okay, so again, Brook Trout outcome goal and how we revised with the new Chesapeake Bay Watershed Agreement. So the 2014 Watershed Agreement, I believe, was the first time brook trout were included in it as an outcome goal, but that goal was to restore and sustain naturally reproducing brook trout populations in Chesapeake Bay headwater streams with an 8% increase in occupied habitat by 2025. So how did we get to, I'm going to start with how we got to where we're at, and then go back into the progress that we've made, getting to the new changes to the outcome. So again, the 14 outcome goal was an increase in 8% occupied habitat. The state jurisdictions during that decade were pretty much not necessarily scrambling, but trying to figure out how to assess all their waters within their states to determine presence absence of all their historically as well as unknown sampled populations. So Maryland wasn't a huge lift. We were able to do that in 5 years. We're a small state with enough staff to get it done. But Pennsylvania, as you all know, has a lot of land and a lot of brook trout streams, process of identifying all their known brook trout populations. But to that end, we had no way to track whether or not projects on the ground were actually contributing to increases in brook trout occupancy to even determine if we were meeting our goal. So I believe in 2021, my predecessor, Steve Faulkner, as well as Katie Ambalski, got funding for a goal implementation team project to develop a way to track BMP projects on the ground, as well as document changes in brook trout occupancy. That report I can make that report available for anyone interested, but the synopsis was that we did actually achieve a 0.5 net increase by 2024, which was 7.5% short of our goal, obviously, but according to the state biologists, where we were seeing losses in other populations was still an overall success on our end. Also in that GET project, there were 5,400 projects identified within the Bay watershed that were related to BMPs that both directly and indirectly might benefit brook trout. However, only 94 of those, or 1.7%, were actually known to be implemented on a site where brook trout were known to be present. 1,600 of those projects, brook trout presence was unknown, and 3,500 of the projects, brook trout data was missing. So of all the work done on the ground, very few were specifically targeted for brook trout. So to that point, where are brook trout within the Bay watershed? This is Trout Unlimited's Eastern brook trout portfolio. It breaks brook trout patches, i.e. watersheds, into 3 categories: strongholds in green, persistent patches, which have healthy populations, but not necessarily the best, they're in orange, and then other marginal populations indicated in yellow. So if you look at the whole Bay watershed outlined in the black and white polygons, brook trout do surprisingly make up a pretty good portion of the total watershed area. Approximately 22.7 when you include all 3 categories of brook trout. But if we're just talking about the healthier populations, stronghold and persistent patches, it breaks out to 13.7% of land area that brook trout streams are drained into. So going back from that map to where brook trout populations are obviously concentrated in certain areas. And if we look at this map here on the right, these are all locations with the 2024 GET report identified all the projects, the 5,400 projects, and where they were done on a landscape. And as you can see by the point on this map, they're pretty much randomly distributed or evenly distributed throughout the Bay watershed. So the fact that only less than 2% were targeted for brook trout, even though they were done relatively evenly throughout the watershed, indicates that there's a lot of potential here to actually do more targeted work on the ground. And just looking at a couple of the projects or BMPs that were done, 233 were earmarked for AOP, 3 brook trout reintroduction efforts, 5 for AMD, 2,500 riparian restoration projects. Again, so a lot of potential here to actually focus work on brook trout, and I'm glad to hear Fish Passage and Fish Habitat are looking forward to working with us to get some stuff done. Okay, so some of the prompting questions I was given, did the language need to be deleted because of new science or policy? We recommended to update the language, which I'll get to in a second. Did new targets need to be set? Yes. Why were these changes happening? Again, I'll get there. And what was the process? So just walking you through these next couple steps. Why did our outcome need to be revised? So the original 8% goal was pretty lofty and wasn't necessarily agreed upon by the state biologists who were doing a lot of the on the ground work for their brook trout populations. Again, the actual increase was only 0.5%, which was well short of the goal. But focusing on occupancy meant that states were spending most of their time just detecting presence absence instead of having more resources and time and capacity to actually do on the ground projects and BMP implementation and prioritize locations where that work needed to be done. So again, a lot of that work was just focused on sampling and monitoring. So state biologists, so working towards new outcome language, state biologists wanted to improve angling opportunities in ongoing monitoring programs within stronghold watersheds. And there was a genuine consensus within our work group to focus effort on the best of the best watersheds, i.e. the stronghold and persistent patches, to improve overall resiliency given changes to climate change and rising temperatures. So to get to the new outcome language, we hosted 2 ad hoc work group meetings as well as our regular spring meeting where we fleshed out and heard from all the state representatives as well as members on ideas for new outcome language. We provided a recommendation to the management board in the spring to update our language to include 3 new outcomes instead of just occupancy. So we were keeping occupancy, we added abundance for the fishery component, and we added resiliency to protect and make better or improve our best of the best watersheds. We're actively working now to derive our outcome targets using the previous GIT report in conjunction with GIS assessments of all the known threats or land use concerns that are pose threats to brook trout. And working with ongoing state, federal, university, and NGO monitoring programs to help inform our new targets. So the new targets and revised outcome language for the watershed agreement is to protect and enhance brook trout within the Chesapeake Bay watershed by increasing occupancy, abundance, and resilience to changing environmental conditions. So the 3 outcomes are occupancy, abundance, and resilience. And then under those 3 are specific goals. So they all start by 2035, increase brook trout occupancy by 1% in watersheds supporting healthy populations, i.e. stronghold and persistent, while achieving no net loss in marginal watersheds. For abundance, it's increase abundance at 10 long-term monitoring sites, and that information is currently being collected by all the supporting state, federal, and university NGO partners that have ongoing long-term monitoring projects. We can identify the best sites to do that in. And then the third goal with resiliency is reduce identified threats by X% to increase brook trout resilience in watersheds supporting healthy populations. Again, those are stronghold and persistent patches, and we are actively working to fill in that XX percentage. So just a rough outline on how we're going to get to those specific targets and percentages. So we took the GIT report that was completed in 2024. The total number of projects that were done by each BMP are in that second column, and that was done over a 7-year period. So we expanded it to a 10-year goal and then divided it by 10 to get our annual goal. This is still in draft form. The final numbers should be coming out in the next month or so. But if we apply a 13.7% land area ratio of our stronghold and persistent patches that I mentioned on the map, we took that 10-year adjusted multiplied by 13.7%. We're probably going to end up just rounding to 15% or 20% to make a nice even number to get at the total number of projects, stream miles, and acres that we need to protect on the landscape to improve overall resiliency. So how do we actually get this done on the ground and hit our targets? We applied for a STAC grant last year, and we were awarded that grant. So Katie and I and Nick worked on hosting workshops in Pennsylvania and Maryland in select counties that have a lot of stronghold watersheds within them. So we were working with local county government, state forestry, abandoned mines, state roads, all the folks that are involved with on the ground threats that need addressed through BMP and acid mine drainage and other projects to improve overall habitat resiliency to help make achieve success. So we had 2 full-day workshops, a lot of good discussions there. The final report is in development now or being initiated, should be out in the next 3 or 4 months, but that will hopefully serve as a blueprint on achieving success, both within the counties we held the workshops in, but also to scale up throughout other counties within the watershed. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks so much, Dan. We do have a couple questions in the chat for you. The first is the focus only going to be on healthy watersheds? Are impaired streams that are recovering from AMD treatment systems going to be considered in these numbers?
Yeah, so all of the above. So it's kind of I don't know if catch-22 is the best word, but as far as occupancy, we want to increase occupancy by 1% in stronghold and persistent patches, but not lose our marginal populations. So there's other ways to achieve that. But AMD, for instance, is a low-hanging fruit. There's a lot of money right now for abandoned mines and acid mine drainage mitigation. So that can both count towards, resiliency and occupancy. Obviously, if you mitigate acid and make it suitable for aquatic life, brook trout can recolonize on their own. And if that's within a stronghold watershed at the Huck 12 or Huck 14 level, that improves resiliency as well as occupancy. So some of these, and the same thing can be said for AOP and, riparian forest buffers, but the focus for resiliency is mainly going to be in stronghold and persistent patches, because the best science, climate science with climate change projections, is looking at possibly a 30 to 40% loss within the Bay watershed of current brook trout habitat. So we want to make sure the best populations are resilient and sustainable under worst case scenarios. A lot of the marginal ones are already on, the fringe of, blanking out tomorrow with, development, poor land use practices, already, marginal temperatures. So the lift is so big there that if we overlook our healthy populations right now, they could also be in jeopardy as well.
Thank you. Another question in the chat is, do you support the use of eDNA for monitoring of BMPs?
Monitoring of BMP. So I'll try to address that. So eDNA is shows promise. It's not 100% accurate though. The science is still not, in my opinion, well described to be able to detect presence and absence, particularly at lower abundant populations. We've done some trials. It's good at detecting presence in high abundance populations where there's a lot of DNA material already in the stream. So as far as BMPs, I think it really depends. You'd have to almost do Backy type design above and below BMP implementation, and then have an understanding of how much background DNA is within the stream already. But in terms of occupancy, if you go from no trout to trout, for example, with acid mine drainage treatment, yes, that certainly serves as an efficient tool to be able to determine success in that category.
Great, thank you so much. And last thing in the Q&A box is not a question, but Werner would just like to let you know, nice job of trying to move to smart metrics. And with that, we can go ahead and move on to stream health with Allison.
Hello. All right, I will try to talk fast. So hi, I'm Allison Santoro. I am one of the co-chairs of the Stream Health Work Group, along with Sarah Weglin. So if you could please move to the next slide, Bianca. All right, so our 2014 language was to continually improve stream health and function throughout the watershed, improve health and function of 10% of stream miles above the 2008 baseline for the Chesapeake Bay watershed. We are on track to meet this milestone. However, we are still crunching the data. The Interstate Commission for the Patuxent River Basin, their scientists have been doing a great job, but just because of the time delays and the effort of collecting data throughout the watershed, we don't have our final numbers yet, but we are on track to meet this. So please, next slide. All right, so after many discussions, the work group has and the management board had came together on the revised watershed agreement draft to continually improve and protect local stream health and function, including their living resources and ecosystem services throughout the watershed, using the best available science to inform land management, planning, and conservation. Now, our specific target is to improve the health and ecological integrity of at least 3% of non-tidal stream miles every 6 years. Next slide. So what was updated? We added some language. So we added and protect to improve and protect, because protecting the local streams prevents the degradation of existing ecological resources, which is very important, especially as we go into more changing environmental conditions. Now, you'll notice that we don't actually have a specific target for protection. We felt that the land protection group, they are incorporating a number of targets that includes something that would cover stream health, and I think that their similar presentation is coming up in a couple of weeks. Is it the 24th of July? I'm sorry, I don't have my calendar specifically, but if you want to hear about the land protection, you can tune into that. So look, to protect local stream health and function, including their living resources and ecosystem services. So we're trying here to better define what is meant by stream health and function, because they're honestly, stream health and function is a little bit of a wishy-washy language. So what we mean is specifically their living resources, which would be their biology, and their ecosystem services, which would be the underlying mechanisms that the streams provide for the watershed. So using the best available science to inform land management, planning, and conservation. This describes the general approach that we're going to take to achieve the outcome. These will be further defined in the management strategies that the group will put together in whatever that looks like following this draft, when the agreement has been signed. All right, so our target is to improve the health and ecological integrity of at least 3% of non-tidal stream miles every 6 years. So this is a measurable and time-bound target. The percent improvement is considered achievable by our scientists. 6 years, we picked that because it's the outcome indicator timeframe. So as I mentioned on the first slide, it takes time to collect data throughout the watershed. And it's about every 6 years is when we get a good enough cycle that covers enough of the watershed that the scientists can really use to understand and analyze that data to understand what has changed with the streams. And that is it for my slides. Hope it was short and sweet.
Thanks, Allison. For the sake of time, we're going to move on real quick. It doesn't look like we have any questions in the chat right now. So we are going to move on to wetlands with Pam.
Hello, everyone. I'm Pam Mason. I'm the chair of the Wetlands Work Group, and I have two vice chairs also with the work group who may or may not be on the call today. I'm not sure. Nancy Shum and Tess Danielson. So we all took on the major responsibility for working collaboratively with all of our partners and our work group members, but also we crosswalked with a lot of other partners and members, some of who presented today on developing our wetlands outcome for beyond 2025. Next slide, please. So our 2014 outcome language is here on the slide. Continually increase capacity of wetlands to provide water quality and habitat benefits. Create or establish 8,500 acres of tidal, non-tidal wetlands. Enhance function of an additional 150,000 acres of degraded wetlands. That was all by 2025. And it did sort of specify that we should focus this in natural or agricultural or natural landscapes. So with this particular outcome and our outcome attainability assessments that were done about started about 2.5 years ago, were completed about a year and a half ago. The wetlands target was very much off track, which is a nice way of saying we hardly had done any of the wetlands work. Certainly nowhere near 85,000 acres, probably less than 10% of that, and maybe about a third or so of wetlands enhancement. Next slide, please. So it turns out, again, why did we need to address this outcome? What needed to be addressed about the outcome? Obviously, with all the different choices, like eliminate the outcome, combine it with something else, it was fairly quickly determined that we weren't proposing to do that, but it did need to be addressed that the original outcome, the 2014, that we'd only accomplished a little less than, somewhere less than 10% of the original acreage targets. So a couple things that we proposed to do was add more specificity by separating, and I know it's interesting because the fish folks put theirs together, but fish and wetlands are different because fish move and wetlands don't, although they do, but we're not going to talk about it that way. So we developed separate targets for tidal and non-tidal wetlands. There's several reasons for this. One of which is in some jurisdictions, they're actually managed by different entities, different agencies have different regulatory and legislative responsibilities. Also, that some of the activities that you might do could be different in order to accomplish restoration and creation, and certainly enhancement of these wetland targets. So some of the actions and much of the management construct and some of the nonprofits that participate in this work sort of work in these separate spaces. Not everybody, though. We do recognize that we keep wetlands under this excuse me, larger wetlands umbrella. The wetlands work group is all wetlands, and then we have conversations that we break out for tidal, non-tidal, but we also have times where we talk about wetlands writ large, and especially in coastal plain areas that is only a portion of the watershed, admittedly, but often the tidal, non-tidal wetlands co-occur right in the landscape. So we also highlighted the need to identify some of the benefits that wetlands provide for society and put that right in our outcome language. We wanted to add protection as a target, and we've heard that mentioned by several of the other speakers too. And specifically also around the fact that there is a protected lands outcome. And so this is an opportunity for us to crosswalk and explicitly include wetlands as a land use, land cover really, in setting protection targets. And then finally, there was a decision made several years ago, and we've been operationalizing, if that's a word, combining what was the Waterbird Action Team, which was sort of a ad hoc arrangement of waterbird experts, and bringing those folks into the Wetlands Work Group. And so because of that incorporation, it led to the need to not lose what was originally the 2014 outcome for waterbirds, but roll that in. So we've incorporated in our proposed outcome language. Next slide, please. So this is what it looks like now. We have simplified the language a bit in what I call the preamble, so the text at the top, Restore, create, enhance, and protect wetlands to support people and living resources, including water birds and fish. We're calling out the water birds, the fish because fish habitat, bat crosswalk, provide water quality, flood, erosion protection, recreation, other valuable benefits. The two people at the end should not be there. There was when we sent these information in to get it set up to get public comment, we realized that people was in there twice, but anyway, I'm sure we can fix that. Our specific numeric targets: restore, create 1,000 acres of tidal wetlands, and enhance 15,000. These targets are all for 2035. So basically 10-year. We used a decade. Non-tidal wetlands target: restore or create 2,000 acres, enhance 15,000 acres by 2035. Those numbers are not far off of what we were actually able to achieve in the last 15 or so years, well, 10 years, but really more than that. So we kind of bounded those with what was pragmatic and what has been achieved. Then for our protected buffer target, again, repeating that this is going to actually be a collaboration with the protected lands outcome. So it will be part of that, and it will be tracked under that goal. The interest in having a protected buffer target is twofold, really. So a lot of it came out of conversations about tidal wetlands specifically, and the idea of tidal wetland and migration corridors, and recognizing that if we developed a outcome and put, created a framework for this partnership in an agreement to say we are going to start getting lands, trying to protect lands that are uphill or upstream or next to or inland, whatever word you want to use to visualize that, are tidal wetlands. So when the tidal wetlands move, the land is already protected at that point. However, we also note with the changing climate conditions and with the difference in hydrology and rainfall and climate, and real obvious example this past weekend, that our non-tidal wetlands could also benefit from the same kind of buffers. They will be in positions where in some places those wetlands will probably want to increase in area extent. Some places they'll want to shrink, but we still want to be able to protect them from stressors. So hence the need for a protected buffer goal. And then finally, water birds as indicators of healthy wetlands. We will develop specific priorities over the next 12 to 18 months. We had focused most of our conversations and our efforts on getting the first two numeric targets, and then working with the protected lands group to talk about the protected buffer. So the water bird conversations are underway. We do have some planning tools and some suitability tools in order to help us do that. We have folks engaged to do it. We just we weren't able to get that all completed by the timeline that was set up for establishing these drafts. I think that's my last slide. Next slide. Yep, that's my last slide. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Pam. We do have a question in the chat, but we are going to come back to it as we're running a little short on time. So we just want to make sure that we can get through this last outcome presentation, and then we will get to the questions if we have a little more time at the end. And yeah, we can go on to SAV with Brooke.
Hey, everybody. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Hi, I am Brooke Landry. I work with the Maryland Department of Natural Resources and run the SAV program for DNR. And I also chair the SAV work group for the Bay program. So if you want to go to the next slide. So this first slide, I'm just going to tell you what the goal was, or what the outcome language was in the 2014 agreement. It was to sustain and increase the habitat benefits of SAV in the Chesapeake Bay, to achieve and sustain the ultimate outcome of 185,000 acres of SAV bay-wide, which is considered necessary for a restored bay. And progress towards that ultimate outcome will be measured by a target of 90,000 acres by 2017 and 130,000 acres by 2025. So this is the language that we were working with during the review and modification period. And if you want to go to the next slide. We decided as a work group and with feedback from the Bay program that we really wanted to do a better job of aligning the SAV outcome with our associated water clarity standards that are used in Maryland, Virginia, and DC. In order to do that, the SAB outcome needed to be increased to 196,000 acres. So in the grand scheme of things, a relatively minor increase. But this alignment does provide a more accurate reflection of the potential SAB extent in each bay segment. We also developed new interim targets using linear regressions on annual baywide totals, and we assumed steady growth for that. Steady growth is not really what we see, but in order to develop those targets, we went ahead and kept it simple and assumed steady growth. The interim targets were established for 5-year intervals, in this case for 2030 and 2035, and they are based on an average 1.1% growth exhibited per year by SAB baywide. We also decided that it would be beneficial to include specific language for each of the bay's salinity zones. So we are, that takes into account and accommodates the variability we see between the salinity zones and between the different SAB communities each year. So if you go to the next slide. With those considerations, the draft outcome language that we developed for the SAB outcome it's not very much different, but it is to sustain and increase the habitat and ecosystem benefits of SAB in the Chesapeake Bay, achieve and sustain the outcome of 196,000 acres of SAB bay-wide necessary for a restored bay. Progress towards this outcome will be measured against interim targets of 90,000 acres by 2030 and 95,000 acres by 2035. And progress will also be measured against the following targets for each salinity zone. Tidal fresh, 21,330 acres. Low salinity, which is the oligohaline, 13,094 acres. Medium salinity, which is the mesohaline zone, 126,032 acres. And high salinity, 35,790 acres. I will point out, unfortunately, I inadvertently left out a couple of the segments in the tidal fresh. I did not include the goals for 2 of the DC segments, the Anacostia and the upper tidal fresh Potomac. So that number for tidal fresh will need to change and it will go up about 400 acres. But besides that, this is the language that we are proposing. Straight, simple, smart, and not much different than what we had, but the interim targets are different. The overall bay-wide target is a little elevated, and then we have these salinity zone targets. And that's all I've got, I think. I don't think I have any more slides in there unless I have a question slide. Yep. So easy peasy.
Awesome. Thank you, Brooke, and thank you for getting us back on time. So we've got a couple questions in the chat, just in general, but Brooke, for you specifically, from Peter Tango, not a question, and also I'm sure not just from Peter, but thank you for the SAB goal alignment, much appreciated update. And from Verna, thinks this is the best example of use of interim targets that SAC has been requesting. So thank you for those comments. Reese, if you want to go to the next slide. So once again, we do have that Q&A box at the bottom for anybody that would like to ask a question. We do have a couple going back for Pam. The first question is, are amphibians more sensitive indicators of healthy wetlands than water birds, and are they included as indicators?
So at this time, the wetlands work group anyway was not actually looking to add biological and species or guild specific indicators. The water birds had already existed in the 2014 agreement, and it was specific to black duck. So what we actually were doing was keeping the black duck, but broadening the guilds to address different kinds of wetlands and different kinds of conditions, and water birds more generically and how they may or may not use wetlands. So it wasn't a matter of trying to choose between indicators of wetlands health, because we're not tracking the birds just as indicators of health. We're also tracking them because they were a wetland endemic species that were identified by people prior to 2014, which I was not included in that conversation. So they're sort of already there. Fish and Wildlife Service has a strong commitment toward black duck. And so what we did is actually expand the sort of bird guilds that we are recommending to consider in order to kind of get to your point, but without actually adding a whole bunch of more biological indicators for wetlands. States and jurisdictions already do biological assessments as well. There's the National Wetlands Assessment, and I know the states in the Bay program participate in that. And different kinds of animals and different kinds of birds and things are already assessed in some ways for that. So we were not at that point looking to try to figure out a new indicator. We were just taking advantage of maximizing what's already going on with water birds. I hope that answers the question.
Thanks, Pam. And another one for you. How did you determine the acres for the new agreement?
So actually there was an assessment, there's a GIS assessment on wetlands gain. So we have a new data, I should have mentioned this because I wrote it down, didn't mention. We have a new data tracking process that was established about 3 years ago because wetlands were not properly being accounted for in what we lovingly call the NEIN, which is the National Environmental Indicator something network. Well, anyway, it's the way we count BMPs. Wetlands are approved as both tidal and non-tidal wetlands are approved BMP practices. And what had happened is over time, we had defaulted as a partnership to just counting the wetlands when they were proposed for BMPs, which lost track of wetlands as habitat, wetlands as recreation, wetlands for cultural, all the other values of wetlands. So we were basically only counting them if they were for water quality purposes. That also meant we were undercounting them, and we were not also able to speak to the habitat attributes from those wetlands because we were using a system that didn't account for that. So we created a system called Habitat Tracker. Devereaux Consulting created it. We're into our third data accounting for that now, so that the system has pretty much been worked out. And in that way, we now have a way to do metrics on wetlands efforts, wetlands projects, because then we specifically try to get to the point of, from the wetlands project proponents, why we ask, like, what are the attributes, what are the functions that they're seeking. So with that, we had historically gone back to the previous data because we have that's new data moving forward. So with our previous data, the GIS team at the Bay program did an analysis and came up with we had our net gain for wetlands, and then we had sort of a way to kind of consider maybe where there's some changes in the system. And so we used numbers based on the assessment from the GIS team, and then we rounded it up sort of to the next 1,000, if you will. So it was less than 1,000 originally for tidal and less than 2,000. We had a larger goal, but some of the partners were a little bit uncomfortable with that. We had a higher number, and that got modified down to the numbers that I presented today.
Thanks, Pam. We've got a couple more questions in the chat. Looks like these ones are directed at Brooke, but again, any of our speakers are welcome to come off mute and give any input. So this one says the interim targets, which are 90,000 and 96,000 acres for SAV, didn't seem to sum to the Bay-wide outcome total of 196,000 acres. Can we help understand that? Oh, looks like Brooke is having some technical difficulties right now. But if we can't get those questions answered during this Q&A, we will absolutely get those in an email to you.
I can answer the second question.
Perfect. Yeah, I'll go ahead and read that out for everybody. The second question is non-tidal stream vegetation included as an indicator in another goal?
The short answer is no. The longer answer is it is part of the suite of metrics that may be included. So the protected lands, so when you mean non-tidal stream vegetation, there's the riparian vegetation that is included in the protected lands goal. One of their forests permanently protects a total of X acres of forest, of which a certain percent are in riparian areas. So that is part of the, they've got that non-tidal riparian area as a goal. In terms of in-stream vegetation, I mean in-stream habitat for non-tidal areas, that is not specifically an indicator. So the Stream Health Work Group uses the what's called the Chesapeake, which is the let me get this right because BIBI stands for a couple things. The Chesapeake Basin-wide Index of Biotic Integrity, and that specifically measures stream macroinvertebrates, the bugs in the stream, which rely on the habitat. So, the better the bugs, arguably the better the habitat. Now, I can't speak for what the fish habitat non-tidal goals will be, though. So that might be incorporated in their assessments, but I think that they're still trying to, or they're going to be working to develop those indicators.
Great, thank you so much. We are just about out of time, so any questions that are left in the chat, we will get to you over email. But thank you for all your participation and all the questions that you've asked today. If you want to go to the next slide. Just as a reminder, this event today is part of a webinar series that we are putting on here at the Chesapeake Bay program, and the next one will be on July 15th, where we'll be going over clean water for a healthy bay, exploring the next revised goal. And we will be getting through all of the revised goals for the watershed agreement in our following webinars. So if you want to register for those, the links to those are on our website and will also be sent out as a follow-up to this webinar. So thank you all again, and thank you to our speakers today for helping us understand a little bit better. Have a great rest of your Tuesday, everybody. Thank you.